Livy Book 38, 31. The Achaean praetor, Philopoemen, had from the beginning espoused the cause of the exiles, and he had always recommended to the Achaeans the curtailment of Spartan power and influence. Now he granted an audience to the complainants. On his proposal, the following decree was then passed: that whereas Titus, Quinctius, and the Romans had transferred to the protection and custody of the Achaeans the strongholds and villages of the Laconian seaboard, and whereas the village of Las had been attacked, and blood had there been shed, although the Spartans were bound by their treaty not to interfere with these places, the treaty would be considered broken unless the perpetrators of the deed and their accomplices were delivered to the Achaeans or Achaeans. Tomato, tomato. Envoys were immediately dispatched to Sparta to demand the surrender of the culprits. The order struck the Spartans as so high-handed and unfair that, had their state enjoyed its ancient standing, they would certainly take up arms forthwith. They were particularly agitated by the fear that once they accepted the yoke by complying with the first commands, Philopoemen would carry through the scheme he had long been working on and deliver Sparta to the exiles. So, in a paroxysm of rage, they murdered 30 men of the party which had been connected with the policies of Philopoemen and the exiles, and decided that the pact with the Achaeans should be revoked. They further decided that envoys should be sent immediately to Cephallenia to surrender Sparta to the consuls Marcus Fulvius and the Romans, and beg the consul to come to the Peloponnese to take the city of Sparta under protection and authority of the Roman people. When the envoys brought back this news to the Achaeans, war was declared on Sparta, with the unanimous agreement of the states at the council meeting. Winter prevented immediate commencement of hostilities, but the territory of the Spartans was subjected to minor incursions, more like piracy than warfare, and not just over land, but with naval attacks from the sea as well. The disorder brought the consul to the Peloponnese. At his behest, a meeting of the consul was called at Elis, and the Spartans were invited to argue their case. This went beyond being a great debate to become a great shouting match. Although the consul had been showing favor to both sides and making diplomatically evasive remarks, he brought closure to the matter with a single command: that they eschew military action until they had sent envoys to the Senate in Rome. A deputation was sent to Rome by both parties, and the Spartan exiles joined their case and their deputation with those of the Achaeans. The leaders of the Achaean delegation were Diophanes and Lycortas, both of Megalopolis. These were political opponents, and on this occasion, too, had very few points of agreement in the speeches they delivered. Diophanes, or Diophanes, advocated leaving everything to the discretion of the Senate, who, he said, would be the best to settle the differences between the Achaeans and the Spartans. Lycortas, who had been briefed by Philopoemen, insisted that the Achaeans should have their right under the treaty and their laws to put their decrees into effect, and that they be granted unrestricted exercise of the freedom which the Romans had themselves vouchsafed to them. At that time, the Achaean people were very influential with the Romans, but even so the decision reached was that there should be no change in regard to the Spartans. However, so cryptic was the Roman answer that the Achaeans took it as permission to act in the case of Sparta, while the Spartans on the other side interpreted it as not giving the Achaeans a completely free hand. The Achaeans were extreme and high-handed in their use of this power. 33. Philopoemen's magistracy was renewed. At the beginning of spring he mobilized an army, pitched camp in Spartan territory, and sent envoys to demand the surrender of the men responsible for the sedition. He promised that their city-state would have peace if the Spartans complied with the order, and that the guilty parties would receive no punishment without a hearing. The others remained silent from fear, but the men whom Philopoemen had named in his demand agreed to go, since they had the assurance from the envoys that they would receive no violent treatment before they pleaded their case. Other prominent men went along with him. Both to support them as private individuals, and also from the belief that their case was important to the interest of the state. The Achaeans had never taken Spartan exiles with them into Spartan territory, because there was evidently nothing as likely to offend the feelings of the citizen body. But on the occasion, the exiles virtually represented the vanguard of the entire army. These formed a column and met the Spartans as they arrived at the gate of the camp. At first they taunted them with abusive comments. Then a wrangle ensued, and as tempers flared, the most hot-blooded of the exiles attacked the Spartans. The Spartans appealed to the gods and to the guarantee given by the envoys, and both the envoys and the praetor tried to drive back the crowd to shield the Spartans and to push away a number of men who were already in the process of shackling them. The crowd swelled after the disturbance broke out. At first the Achaeans swiftly converged on the spot to see what was happening. Then the exiles loudly proclaimed their past sufferings and begged for assistance, claiming they would never have such an opportunity again if they let this one slip. The treaty, they said, had been solemnly ratified on the Capitol at Olympia and on the Athenian Acropolis, and this had been abrogated by these men, so they should punish the guilty before they were restricted one more by another treaty. The crowd were roused to anger by these words, and when one man cried out that they should give the Spartans a thrashing, they proceeded to hurl stones. So it was that 17 of the Spartans who had been shackled in the fracas lost their lives. The next day, a further 63 were arrested. These the praetor had protected against violent treatment, not because he wanted them unharmed, but because he did not want them to put to death without a hearing. They were now thrown to the angry mob. After uttering a few words that fell on deaf ears, they were all condemned and handed over for execution. 34. The Spartans, terrified by this episode, were first of all ordered to tear down their walls. Next, they were told that all foreign auxiliary troops who had been mercenaries under the tyrants, should quit Laconian territory, and then that slaves freed by the tyrants, and there were large numbers of these, should leave before a certain date, with the Achaeans having the right to seize, take away, and sell any who remained. They were also ordered to repeal the legislation and system of Lycurgus, and acclimatize themselves to Achaean laws and institutions. In this way they would become a united body, and find it easier to reach agreement on everything they were told. No condition did the Spartans fulfill with more readiness than the demolition of their walls, and none more reluctantly than the recall of the exiles. The decree related to their restoration was passed in a full council of the Achaeans in Tegea, or Tegea, spelled Tegea. It was also noted at the meeting that the foreign auxiliaries had been dismissed, and that the newly enfranchised Spartans, as they called the men freed by the tyrants, had left the city and scattered into the countryside. It was decided that, before the demobilization of the army, the praetor should go at the head of the light infantry and arrest men in this situation, and sell them under the law pertaining to plunder. Many were arrested and put on sale, and a portico at Megalopolis, which the Spartans had destroyed, was rebuilt from the proceeds, with the agreement of the Achaeans. In addition, the territory of Belbina, which had been unlawfully seized by the tyrants of Sparta, was returned to that state under an old statute passed during the reign of Philip, son of Amyntas, or Amyntas, spelt Amyntas. The state of Sparta was virtually drained of her strength by these measures, and was long subject to the Achaeans. But nothing was so harmful to them as the removal of the discipline of Lycurgus, to which they had accustomed themselves over a period of 800 years. (35) Marcus Fulvius left the council in which the debate between the Achaeans and Spartans had taken place before the consul, and came to Rome for the elections, the year being now at an end. There he supervised the election of Marcus Valerius Messala and Gaius Livius Salinator as consuls. After rejecting the candidacy of his enemy, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who was also seeking election that year, the following were then elected praetor: Quintus Marcius, Philippus, Marcus Claudius, Marcellus, Gaius Stertinius, Gaius Antinius, Publius Claudius Pulcher, and Lucius Manlius Acidinus. The elections finished, it was decided that the consul Marcus Fulvius should return to his province and to his army, and both he and his colleague, Gnaeus Manlius, had their commands extended for a year. In the temple of Hercules, a statue of the god was that year erected at the direction of the Decemvirus, or Decemvirus. Again, you decide. Decemviris. My readings aren't for Latin students, to say the least. And a 6-horse chariot overlaid with gold was set up by Gnaeus Cornelius on the Capitol, with an inscription stating that it was donated by the consul. 12 gilded shields were also set up on the Capitol by the curule Attalus, Publius Claudius Pulcher, and Servius Sulpicius Galba, paid from fines they imposed on grain merchants for hoarding grain supplies. In addition, the plebeian aedile Quintus Fulvius Flaccus erected 2 statues overlaid with gold, after the conviction of a single defendant, the aediles having brought independent prosecutions. His colleague, Aulus Cecilius, succeeded in prosecuting nobody. The Roman games were repeated in their entirety 3 times, the plebeian games 5 times. After entering their consulship on the 15th of March, Marcus Valerius Messala and Gaius Livius Salinator consulted the Senate on civic affairs and on the provinces and the armies for them. No change was made with regard to Aetolia and Asia, and one of the consuls was assigned Pisae and the Ligurians as his province, the other Gaul. They were instructed to settle the allocation between themselves or by lot, and to raise for themselves 2 armies, each comprising 2 legions, and to requisition from the allies and the Latin League 15,000 infantry for each army, as well as a total of 1,200 horse. The Ligurians fell to Messala, and Gaul to Salinator. The Praetorian sortition after this went as follows. Marcus Claudius, urban jurisdiction. Publius Claudius, foreign jurisdiction. Quintus Marcius, Sicily. Gaius Stertonius, Sardinia. Lucius Manlius, hither Spain. Gaius Antonius, farther Spain. 36. The following decisions were reached with respect to the armies. The legions formerly under the command of Gaius Laelius were to be transferred from Gaul to the propraetor Marcus Tucius for service in Bruttium. The army in Sicily was to be disbanded, and the propraetor Marcus Sempronius was to bring back to Rome the fleet in the province. The Spanish provinces were each allocated the single legion already stationed in them, and each of the praetors was given the authority to requisition from the allies and take with him a supplementary force of 3,000 infantry and 200 cavalry. Before the new magistrates set out for their provinces, a 3-day period of public prayer was imposed at all the crossroads in the name of the College of Decemvirs, because darkness had fallen between roughly the 3rd and 4th hours of daylight. A 9-day sacrifice was also proclaimed after a shower of stones on the Aventine. Following a senatorial decree of the previous year, the censors had obliged the Campanians to register for the census at Rome, since it had not been clear earlier where they should register. The Campanians now requested that they be allowed to take wives who were Roman citizens, and that any who had already taken them be permitted to keep them. And they also asked that any children born to them before that date be considered as legitimate and able to inherit. Both requests were granted. The tribune of the plebs, Gaius Valerius Atapo, promulgated a bill relating to the townspeople of Formiae Fundae and Arpinum, which gave these peoples the right to vote, for up to that time they had held citizenship without voting rights. 4 tribunes of the plebs vetoed the proposal on the ground that it did not have the approval of the Senate, but when they were told it was the people's prerogative to bestow the right of suffrage as they wished, and not the Senate's, they withdrew their initial objection. A law permitting the people of Formiae and Fundae to vote in the Aemilian tribe, and the people of Arpinum in the Cornelian tribe, was then passed, and this was the first occasion on which these peoples were registered in these tribes in accordance with the Valerius's resolution. After besting Titus Quinctius in the drawing of lots, the censor Marcus Claudius Marcellus performed the closing ceremony for the census. The citizens registered in the census numbered 258,318. When the closing ceremony was done, the consuls left for their provinces. (37) During the winter of these events at Rome, Gnaeus Manlius was in his winter quarters in Asia. Deputations came to him, first in his capacity as consul, and subsequently as proconsul, and they came from every quarter, from all the states and peoples living this side of the Taurus range. And while victory over Antiochus was more prestigious and glorious in Roman eyes than the Gallic victory for the allies, that over the Gauls was a greater source of joy than the victory over Antiochus. Submission to the king had been easier to bear than the barbarous savagery of the Gauls, and the daily incertitude and fear of where their pillaging would descend like a tempest. These people, then, had been granted freedom by the defeat of Antiochus, and peace by the subjugation of the Gauls, and they had not just come to Manlius to offer congratulations, but had also brought him crowns of gold varying in value according to the resources of each. Envoys also arrived from Antiochus and even from the Gauls to have peace terms dictated to them, and some came from Ariarathes, king of Cappadocia, to ask for the pardon and to pay compensation for the wrong the king had done in giving Antiochus military assistance. Ariarathes was ordered to pay 600 talents of silver, and the reply given to the Gauls was that Manlius would give them his terms when Eumenes came. The deputations from the city-states were sent away with courteous replies, and even happier than when they arrived. The envoys of Antiochus were instructed to take money and grain to Pamphylia, in accordance with the pact made with Lucius Scipio, and were informed that Manlius would proceed there with his army. At the beginning of spring, Manlius set out after the ritual purification of his army and came to Apamea 7 days later. He encamped there for 3 days, and with a further 3 days' march from Ampea reached Pamphylia, where he had ordered the king's representatives to take the money and the grain. Here 2,500 talents of silver were taken in and transported to Apamea, and the grain was distributed amongst the troops. Manlius then marched to Perga, the only place in the area occupied by a garrison of the king. As he drew near, he was met by the commander of the garrison, who asked for a moratorium of 30 days in which to consult Antiochus about the surrender of the city. Granted the time, the commander left with the garrison on the specified date. The consul sent his brother Lucius Manlius from Perga to Oroanda with 4,000 men to collect the remainder of the money which the people of Oroanda had agreed to pay, since he had been told that Eumenes and the 10 commissioners had arrived in Ephesus from Rome. Manlius himself led the army back to Apamea, ordering Eumenes' representatives to follow him. (38) At Apamea, a treaty with Antiochus was drawn up on the recommendation of the 10 commissioners, worded roughly as follows. There is to be peace between Antiochus and the Roman people on the following terms and conditions. The king is not to permit to pass through his lands or those of peoples who shall be subject to him any army intending to make war on the people of Rome or their allies, or to help with provisions, or give it any other form of assistance. The Romans and their allies are to make the same commitment to Antiochus and those who shall be subject to his rule. Antiochus is not to have the right to make war on the peoples of the islands or to cross to Europe. Antiochus is to withdraw from the cities, territories, villages, and strongholds this side of the Taurus range as far as the river Tanais, and from the valley of the Taurus to the heights where the range slopes towards Laconia. From the towns, territories, and strongholds from which he withdraws, Antiochus is to take away nothing apart from his weaponry, and anything he has removed he is to return to where it belongs. Antiochus is not to take any soldier or any other person from the kingdom of Eumenes. With regard to citizens of those cities separating from Antiochus's empire, who are with Antiochus and within the bounds of his realm, these are all to return to Apamea by a fixed date. Any people now with the Romans or their allies, but who are subjects of Antiochus, are to have the right to leave or to stay. The king is to return to the Romans and their allies slaves, whether runaways or prisoners of war, and all freemen, whether prisoners or deserters. Antiochus is to surrender all his elephants and not acquire others. He is also to surrender his warships with their equipment and retain in his possession no more than 10 passenger vessels, none of them propelled by more than 30 oars, nor smaller than that, for a war in which he will be on the offensive. He is not to sail beyond the promontories of Calicaednus or Sarpedonium, except when a ship will be carrying tribute, payment, envoys, or hostages. Antiochus is not to have the right to hire mercenaries from the peoples in the power of the Roman people, or accept volunteers from them. Houses and buildings belonging to Rhodians or Rhodian allies within the bounds of Antiochus's kingdom shall remain the property of the Rhodians and allies on the same legal basis as before the war. In the case of financial debts, these may be called in, and the right to search for, identify, and recover any property that has been removed shall also obtain. Antiochus is also to remove his garrisons from any cities which are due to be surrendered and which are held by people on whom he conferred them, and he is to ensure that these are properly handed over. Antiochus is to pay 12,000 Attic talents of unadulterated silver in equal installments within a period of 12 years, with a talent to weigh not less than 80 Roman pounds, and 540,000 measures of wheat. He is to pay King Eumenes 350 talents within a 5-year period, as well as the 127 talents in lieu of grain, as had been assessed. He is to give the Romans 20 hostages, changing them every 3 years, none of them being younger than 18 or older than 45. In the case of military aggression against Antiochus by any of the allies of the Roman people, he is not to have the right to fend off force with force, provided that he neither hold in subjection any city under the rules of war, nor accept any in alliance. The two parties are to settle their differences by legal and judicial procedure, or, if both agree, by war. There was also a clause included in the treaty about the surrender of the Carthaginian Hannibal, the Aetolian Thoas, the Acarnanian Menosalocus, and the Chalcidians, Ubolidas and Philo, and others stating that any additions, removals, or modifications subsequently negotiated could be made without invalidating the treaty. 39. The consul took an oath to observe the treaty, and Quintus Minucius Thermus and Lucius Manlius, who happened to come back from Oroanda just at that time, left to demand an oath of compliance from the king. The consul also wrote to Quintus Fabius Labio, commander of the fleet, ordering him to leave for Patara immediately, and break up and burn any of the king's ships that were docked there. Leaving Ephesus, Labio smashed or burned 50-decked ships, and on the same expedition he accepted the surrender of Telmesus, whose inhabitants were terror-stricken by the sudden approach of the fleet. Ordering the troops left at Ephesus to follow, he immediately crossed from Lycia to Greece, by way of the islands, and after spending a few days in Athens to allow the ships to reach Piraeus from Ephesus, he brought the whole fleet back from there to Italy. Gnaeus Manlius made a gift to Eumenes of all the elephants he received from Antiochus. These were amongst the various items he was supposed to receive from the king. He had looked into the concerns of the city-states, many of which were in turmoil as a result of the changed conditions. Thanks to the intervention of Eumenes, to whom he had at this time betrothed his daughter, Ariarathes was excused payment of half the money demanded of him, and was accepted as a friend of Rome. After examining the cases they presented, the 10 commissioners made various dispositions for the various states. They granted tax exemption to those which had been paying tribute to Antiochus, and had sided with the Roman people, but ordered all those who had supported Antiochus, or who had paid tribute to Attalus, to pay taxes to Eumenes. In addition, they made special grants of tax exemption to the Colophonians living in Notium, to the Cymaeans and the Melassenians. To the people of Clazomene they made a gift of the island of Drymusa, in addition to exemption from taxes. To the Milesians they restored the so-called sacred territory, and to the people of Ilium they also made a gift of Rotium and Gergithus, less because of any recent services on their part than from consideration of the Romans' ancestry. The same reasons lay behind the liberation of Dardanus. They also made gifts of land to the Chians, the Smyrnians, and the Erythraeans, in recognition of their exemplary loyalty in the war, according them every mark of honor. The Phocaeans had the territory which they possessed before the war restored to them, and they were also granted the right to live under their ancient laws. The people of Rhodes were given confirmation of what they had been granted by their earlier decree. They were accorded Lycia and Coraria, as far as the river Meander, with the exception of Telemesus. To Eumenes' realm the commissioners added, in Europe, the Chersonese and Lysimachia, and the strongholds, villages, and lands that had been within the territory held by Antiochus, and in Asia. They were restored to him both. Phrygius, and one called Hellespontine Perugia, and the other greater Perugia, as well as Mysia, which Prusias had filched from Eumenes. Laconia, Milias, and Lydia, the cities of Tralles, Ephesus, and Telemassus, being specifically mentioned by name. There was a dispute between Eumenes and the representatives of Antiochus over Pamphylia, because part of it lies this side of and part beyond the Taurus, and the whole matter was referred to the Senate. 40. After issuing these terms and decrees, Manlius set off for the Hellespont with the 10 commissioners and the entire army. There he called to him the chieftains of the Gauls and specified the terms under which they were to keep peace with Eumenes. He informed them that they were to discontinue their practice of armed migrations and keep within the boundaries of their own lands. He then brought together ships from all along the coast and had Eumenes' fleet brought there from Elea by the king's brother, Athenias. With these he transported all his troops over to Europe. Then at the head of the column, weighed down with booty of all kinds, he proceeded by short marches through the Chersonese and established a base at Lysimachia. He wanted to have his pack animals in as fresh and vigorous a condition as possible for embarking on the march into Thrace, the journey through which the men mostly contemplated with dread. On the day he left Lysimachia, Manlius reached the river they call the Milas, and the day after that he reached Cypsela. After Cypsela, spelt Cypsela, he faced a narrow broken road for approximately 10 miles through a wooded area, and the difficulty this stage of the journey presented made him split the army in two. He ordered one part to go on ahead and the other to leave a large interval before bringing up the rear, and he set between these two the baggage, which comprised carts loaded with public money and other rich booty. As the Romans were marching in the formation through a pass, a band of Thracians, numbering not more than 10,000, and drawn from 4 tribes, the Astae, the Caenae, the Maguateni, and the Corelli, blocked the road right at the neck of the defile. It was thought that this did not happen without the complicity of Philip of Macedon. It was believed that Philip knew that the only route the Romans would take for their return journey lay through Thrace, and that he also knew how much money they were transporting. The commander was at the head of the column, and he was worried about the difficulty of the terrain. The Thracians made no move until the armed troops went by, but when they saw that the vanguard was past the neck of the defile, and that the troops at the rear were still not close, they pounced upon the baggage train. They killed the guards, and some of them pillaged the contents of the wagons, while others dragged away the pack animals together with their loads. The shouts from the action first reached those following behind, who had now entered the pass, and then carried to the front of the column as well. There was a rush to the center from each end, and haphazard fighting broke out at several places at the same time. The booty itself exposed the Thracians to carnage. They were encumbered by their loads, and most were without weapons, so as to have their hands free to seize the plunder. It was the difficulty of the terrain that hurt the Romans, since the barbarians used paths which they knew to fall upon them, and sometimes concealed themselves in ambush in the deep hollows. The loads and wagons themselves, adversely positioned for one side or the other, as chance would have it, also obstructed the combatants. In one sector the looter fell, in another the men defending the loot. The fortunes of the battle varied according to whether the lie of the land was favorable or unfavorable, for this side or that, according to the spirit of the fighters, and according to the numbers involved, for some had met numbers superior and others numbers inferior to their own. There were heavy casualties on both sides. Night was already coming on when the Thracians left the battle, not running to avoid wounds or death, but because they had sufficient booty. 41. The leading companies of the Roman column bivouacked in the open area outside the pass near the temple of Bendis. The rest remained within the pass, surrounding themselves with a double palisade to guard the baggage. The following day they reconnoitred the pass before striking camp, and then joined the first contingent. In that battle, fought as it was at several points virtually all along the pass, some of the baggage and some camp followers were lost, as well as a number of fighting men. But the most serious setback was the death of Quintus Minucius Thermus, a courageous and energetic man. That day the Romans reached the river Hebrus, after which they crossed the frontier of the Aenians, close to the temple of Apollo, whose local title is Xerenethius. They were faced with another gorge, no less rugged than the earlier one, near a place called Tempara. But because there is no woodland in the area, it does not offer hiding places for an ambush. On this spot, the Trazi, also a Thracian people, converged with similar hopes of plunder. But since the treeless valleys rendered them visible as they were blocking the pass, there was less panic and consternation amongst the Romans, for despite the unfavorable terrain, it was nevertheless a regular engagement that had to be fought with lines out in the open and troops deployed. The Romans approached in close formation. With a shout they attacked, at first dislodging the enemy, and then driving them back. Now began the flight and slaughter, the Thracians being obstructed by the narrowness of the terrain which they had themselves chosen. The victorious Romans pitched camp near a village of the Maronians called Sally. The following day, a march along an open road brought them to the Pre-Attic plain, where they stayed for 3 days, provisioning themselves with grain. Some of this was provided by the Maronians from their own fields, and some came from the Roman ships, which followed them loaded with all manner of supplies. From the camp it was a day's march to Apollonia, and from here they came through the land of Abdera to Neapolis. This part of the route, thanks to the presence of the Greek colonies, was completely peaceful, but after that the journey through central Thrace, though without event, was day and night fraught with anxiety until they reached Macedonia. The same army, led by Scipio along the same route, had not found the Thracians so aggressive for the simple reason that there had been less booty to invite an attack. Although, even on that occasion, according to Claudius, some 15,000 Thracians confronted mutinies. No, that would be... Again, it's not mutinies. That is actually someone's name. Let's see. Here we go. Let me find the beginning of this sentence. It's a bit of a run-on. Here we go again. The same army, led by Scipio along the same route, had not found the Thracians so aggressive for the simple reason that there had been less booty to invite an attack. although even on that occasion, according to Claudius, some 15,000 Thracians confronted Mutenes, the Numidian, when he was reconnoitering ahead of the main column. Claudius states that the Numidian force consisted of 400 cavalry and a few elephants, and that Mutenes' son broke through the enemy center with 100 hand-picked horsemen, setting his elephants in the center and deploying his cavalry on the wings. Mutenes engaged the enemy, and in a short while the son caused panic in the enemy ranks with an attack from the rear. The Thracians were thrown off balance by this furious cavalry charge and failed to reach the column of infantry. Incidentally, Mutenes, spelt Muttines, Mutenes. Gnaeus Manlius led the army through Macedonia and into Thessaly. He continued from there through Epirus to Apollonia, and spent the winter in Apollonia, for he did not have such little regard for the sea in winter as to risk a crossing. 42. It was close to the end of the year when the consul Marcus Valerius came to Rome from Liguria to see to the appointment of the new magistrates, though he had achieved nothing of note in his province to provide a reasonable excuse for his arriving later than usual for the elections. The consular elections were held on the 18th of February, and at these Marcus Aemilius Lepidus and Gaius Flaminius were chosen. The next day the following were designated praetors: Appius Claudius Pulcher, Servius Sulpicius Galba, Quintus Terentius Coleo, Lucius Terentius Massiliota, Quintus Fulvius Flaccus, and Marcus Furius Crescipes. At the conclusion of the elections, the consul brought before the Senate the question of the provinces to be assigned to the praetors. The senators decided that 2 jurisdictions should be at Rome for legal administration. 2, Sicily and Sardinia, should be outside Italy, and 2, Tarentum and Gaul, within Italy. The praetors designate were also instructed to draw lots for these before entering office. The sortition went as follows: Servius Sulpicius, urban jurisdiction; Quintus Terentius, foreigners' jurisdiction; Lucius Terentius, Sicily; Quintus Fulvius, Sardinia; Appius Claudius, Tarentum; Marcus Furius, Gaul. That year, on the order of Marcus Claudius, the urban praetor Lucius Minucius Myrtilus and Lucius Manlius were handed over to ambassadors by the Fetial priests and taken off to Carthage because they had allegedly beaten some Carthaginian envoys. There was talk of a major war in Liguria, which was said to be growing more serious every day. Accordingly, on the day on which the new consuls raised with them the matter of the provinces and the state of the republic, the senators formally assigned Liguria to both of them as their province. The consul Lepidus tried to block the Senate's decision, claiming that it was outrageous for the 2 consuls to be confined to the valleys of Liguria, when Marcus Fulvius and Gnaeus Manlius had spent 2 years in Europe and Asia respectively, ruling like monarchs and virtually replacing Philip and Antiochus. If it was necessary to secure those provinces with armies, it should be the consuls who commanded them, and not individuals without office. Those men had been roaming around spreading the fear of war amongst tribes on whom war had not been declared, he said, and charging a price for peace. If those provinces needed to be secured by armies, then just as Manius Acilius had been replaced by the consul Lucius Scipio, and then Lucius Scipio by Marcus Fulvius and Gnaeus Manlius, when they became consuls, so Fulvius and Manlius should have been replaced by the consuls Gaius Livius and Marcus Valerius. The Aetolian War was over, he said. Asia had been recovered from Antiochus, and the Gauls had been defeated. Now, surely, either the consuls should be sent to the consular armies, or the legions there should be brought home and finally restored to the state. After listening to these arguments, the Senate remained firm in its judgment that Liguria should be the province of the two consuls, but decided that Manlius and Fulvius should quit their provinces, withdraw their armies from them, and return to Rome. 43. There was no love lost between Marcus Fulvius and the consul Marcus Aemilius. In particular, Aemilius supposed that it was because of Marcus Fulvius's devices that his consulship had been retarded 2 years. Accordingly, to provoke antipathy towards Fulvius, Aemilius brought before the Senate some Ambracian envoys whom he had primed with accusations. These protested that they had been subject to aggression despite the fact that they had been at peace with Rome, had done the bidding of the former consuls, and had been ready to show the same compliance to Marcus Fulvius. First of all, their lands had been plundered, they said, and their city faced with dreadful prospect of pillage and massacre, fear of which compelled them to shut their gates. Then they had been blockaded, attacked, and subjected to every form of treatment meted out in war, with massacres, burning, and the destruction and plundering of the city. Their wives and children had been dragged off into slavery, their property had been taken from them, and, what distressed them more than anything else, their temples had throughout the entire city been stripped of their ornaments, the statues of the gods. No, the gods themselves had been torn from their dwellings and carried off, and all the Ambracians had been left for their worship, and their offerings of prayers and supplications were bare walls and doorposts. While the envoys made these complaints, the consul followed a prearranged plan, questioning them in an accusing manner, and thus appearing to entice from them more than they would have said on their own. The senators were impressed by this, but the other consul, Gaius Flaminius, came to the defense of Marcus Fulvius. The Ambracians had taken an old and outmoded course, he said, for such were the charges brought earlier against Marcus Marcellus by the Syracusans, and against Quintus Fulvius by the Campanians. So why should the senators not allow that line of attack against Titus Quinctius by King Philip, he asked, or against Manius Acilius and Lucius Scipio by Antiochus, or against Gnaeus Manlius by the Gauls, and against Marcus Fulvius himself by the Aetolians and the peoples of Cephallenia? Ambracia was attacked and captured, Flaminius continued. Statues and artworks were taken from it, and other things occurred that are normally associated with the capture of cities. Do you think that I will deny this on Marcus Fulvius's behalf, members of the Senate, or that Marcus Fulvius himself will deny it, when he is going to request of you a triumph for these actions, and will bear before his chariot, and affix to his doorpost, conquered Ambracia, the statues which they charge him with taking from there, and all the other spoils from that city? The Ambracians have no reason to disassociate themselves from the Aetolians. The Ambracian cause and the Aetolian cause are the same. Accordingly, my colleague should vent his hostility in some other cause, or, if he prefers to concentrate especially on this one, let him keep his Ambracians here until Marcus Fulvius arrives. For my part, I am not going to allow any decision to be made on either the Aetolians or the Ambracians in the absence of Marcus Fulvius. 44. Aemilius now attacked the cunning and the spite of his political opponent, suggesting that it was something of which all were aware, and claiming that Fulvius would stall and draw out the time so as not to come to Rome while his enemy was still consul. 2 days were spent on the struggle between the consuls, and it appeared that no decision could be taken while Flaminius was present. However, the Senate took advantage of the moment when Flaminius happened to be absent through illness, and passed a decree on a motion from Aemilius that the Ambracians should have all their property restored. They were also to be independent and live under their own laws and gather whatever tariffs they wished on goods carried by land and sea, provided that the Romans, their allies, and members of the Latin League be exempted. As for the statues and other works of art which the Ambracians complained had been removed from their holy shrines, the Senate decided that the matter should be referred to the College of Priests on Marcus Fulvius's return to Rome, and that the college's decisions to put into effect. And the college's decisions be put into effect. Not content with this, the consul subsequently capitalized on the poorly attended session of the House to add a senatorial decree which stated that it did not appear that Ambracia had been taken by force. After this, by decree of the Decemvirs, public prayers were offered for 3 days on behalf of the health of the people, because a deadly plague had been taking a heavy toll in the city and the countryside. Then the Latin festival took place. When they were freed from these religious duties and had completed the muster of the troops, for both preferred to employ new recruits, the consuls set off for their province, where they demobilized all the veterans. After the departure of the consuls, the proconsul Gnaeus Manlius came to Rome, granted an audience with the Senate at the temple of Belons by the praetor Servius Sulpicius. Manlius gave an account of his achievements and demanded that, in view of these, the immortal gods be appropriately honored, and he be permitted to ride in triumph into the city. His request was opposed by a majority of the 10 commissioners who had been with him, and especially by Lucius Furius Porphyrio and Lucius Aemilius Polus. 45. These said that they had been assigned as commissioners to Gnaeus Manlius in order to make peace with Antiochus and finalize the terms of the pact initially formulated with Lucius Scipio. Gnaeus Manlius had done everything he could to jeopardize the peace treaty, they said, and to catch Antiochus in a trap if the king gave him the chance. But Antiochus had recognized the consul's duplicity, and though Manlius had tried to lure him with numerous requests for conferences, he had avoided not only meeting him, but even setting eyes on him. Manlius wanted to cross the Taurus range, and it was only with difficulty that he was restrained from the combined entreaties of all the commissioners from putting to the test the prediction of disaster made in the Sibylline verses for those who pass those fatal bonds. He brought up his army even so, and encamped almost on the crest, at the point where the waters divide, finding no pretext for opening hostilities here, since the king's people kept the peace, which he made war without senatorial authorization or directive from the people, who they asked had never presumed to take this action on his own authority. The most recent wars were with Antiochus, Philip, Hannibal, and the Carthaginians, they said, and in every case there had been a resolution of the Senate and a directive from the people. Restitution had been formally demanded by means of embassies, and finally men had been sent with the declaration of war. Which of those protocols was followed in your case, Gnaeus Manlius, they continued, to lead us to believe that that war of yours was one officially fought by the people of Rome, and not a piece of private buccaneering on your part? But of course you were satisfied with your procedure, and you then took your army by a direct route against the enemies you had made your target? Or did you rather take all the circuitous routes, stopping at crossroads so that you, a money-grubbing consul, could follow with a Roman army wheresoever Eumenes' brother Attalus directed his column? And did you make your way into all the nooks and crannies of Pisidia, Laconia, and Pyregia, collecting your cash from tyrants and occupants of lonely fortresses? For what do you have to do with the people of Oroanda, or with other similarly inoffensive peoples? As for the war itself, the war for which you are requesting a triumph, how did you conduct it? Did you have favorable ground for the battle and a time of your choosing? You are quite correct in demanding that the immortal gods be shown due honor. First of all, they did not want the army to pay for the recklessness of its commander, whose campaign was in flagrant contravention of international conventions. And secondly, they set before us beasts instead of soldiers. 46. Do not think that it is just the name of Galogrecians that is a mongrel. Long before they received that name, their physique and character showed the effects of interbreeding and contamination. If they really were the Gauls with whom we had 1,000 encounters in Italy with mixed success, do you think, considering your commander, that even a messenger would have returned from there? Twice he fought with them, twice he attacked them on unfavorable terrain, bringing his fighting line up almost beneath the feet of the enemy in a valley below them. They could have crushed us without hurling their weapons at us from above. They only had to throw their naked bodies at us. So what was the result? Great is the fortune of the Roman people, great and awesome its reputation. The recent defeat of Hannibal, Philip, and Antiochus had left the Gauls almost stupefied. For all their massive physique, they were thrown into panic, stricken flight by slings and arrows. Not a sword was bloodied in the fighting, in a battle with the Gauls. They flew off like flocks of birds at the first sound of our projectiles. But my word, we were the same force that was cut down, put to flight, and robbed of its baggage when we fell among Thracian bandits on the return journey. And fortune reminded us of what would have happened had we faced a real enemy, along with many other brave men, Quintus, Minucius, Thermus, met his end, a loss much more serious than if Gnaeus Manlius had perished. The man whose recklessness had precipitated that debacle. The army bringing back the spoils of Antiochus was broken up into 3 pieces, the vanguard in one place, the rear in another, and the baggage in a third, and it spent a night hiding in the bushes in the lairs of wild animals. Is it for this that a triumph is requested, even if no defeat or ignominy had been incurred in Thrace? Who are the enemies over whom you would be requesting your triumph? Those, I suppose, whom the Senate or Roman people had specifically assigned to you as enemies. This was how a triumph came to be awarded over Antiochus to Lucius Scipio here, and to Manius Acilius before him, and over Philip a little earlier to Titus Quinctius, and over Hannibal, the Carthaginians, the Sphax to Publius Africanus. And even after the Senate had voted for war, the most minor details were still investigated. To whom was the declaration of war to be made? Was it to be declared to the kings themselves, or was it an announcement to some outpost? Was it to be declared to the kings themselves, or was an announcement to some outpost good enough? Do you want this entire protocol degraded and destroyed? Fetial rites removed and the fetial priest done away with? Heaven forgive me for saying so, but let religious observances be discontinued, and let forgetfulness of the gods seize your hearts. You still do not wish that consultation of the Senate in the case of war also be abandoned, do you? That the question of whether they wish and command a war to be fought with the Gauls not be put to the people? It is true that the consuls recently wanted Greece and Asia, but when you insisted on assigning them Liguria as their province, they accepted your decision. They will thus be justified in seeking a triumph from you in the war, if the war is successful, since it is by your authorization that they will have fought it. 47. Such was the address presented by Furius and Aemilius. Manlius, I have gathered, replied more or less as follows. Members of the Senate, it was the tribunes of the plebs who would in the past oppose applications for a triumph. I now give my thanks to the tribunes. They have granted, either to me personally or to the greatness of my achievements, the distinction of not only approving by their silence the honor which I seek, but also of appearing ready to propose it, if need be. It is amongst the 10 commissioners, for heaven's sake, that I find my opponents, a board assigned to generals by your ancestors to regulate and distribute the honors of victory. Lucius Furius and Lucius Aemilius are trying to stop me from mounting the triumphal car, and to snatch the crown of honor from my head. And these are men whom I should have called as witnesses of my achievements, if the tribunes now stood in the way of my triumph. I certainly begrudge no man his meed of honor. Members of the Senate, and you yourselves recently used your authority to discourage some brave and energetic plebeian tribunes who were trying to block the triumph of Quintus Fabius Labeo. Labeo had his triumph despite his opponent's contention, and not that he had fought an unauthorized campaign, but that he had not set eyes on the enemy at all. In my case, I fought many a pitched battle with 100,000 of our most fierce enemies captured or killed. More than 40,000 men stormed 2 of their camps, and left everything this side of the Taurus range more peaceful than the land of Italy. And I am not only being cheated of my triumph, but am pleading my case before you in person, members of the Senate, with my own commissioners pressing the charges. As you observed, members of the Senate, their line of attack was twofold. They said I should not have fought a war with the Gauls, and then that the war was fought in a foolhardy and reckless fashion. The Gauls were not our enemies, they said, but you assaulted them when they were at peace and doing our bidding. Members of the Senate, I am not going to ask you to apply to your thinking about the Gauls who live in Asia that you generally know about, the brutality of the Gallic race, and their rancorous hatred for the Roman name. Set aside the ill fame attached to the race as a whole, and the loathing felt for it, and consider these Gauls on their own. I wish that Eumenes and all the cities of Asia could be present, that you could hear their complaints rather than my accusations. Come now, send delegations around all the cities of Asia, and ask them which was the heavier servitude from which they were delivered. Was it from Antiochus, when he was pushed back beyond the Taurus range, or from the Gauls, when they were brought to heel? Let them tell you how often their lands were devastated, how often they were pillaged, at a time when they barely had the means to ransom their prisoners, and when they were told of human sacrifices and the immolation of their own children. Be assured that your allies had been paying tribute to the Gauls, and, if I had remained inactive, that they would have been paying it even now, when, thanks to you, they have been freed from the king's rule. "48. The further Antiochus had been driven back, the more despotic Gallic dominion in Asia would have been, and all territory this side of the Taurus range you would have been adding to the empire of the Gauls, not to your own. All right, you will say. Be that as it may, the fact is that at one time the Gauls had pillaged Delphi, oracle, shared by the human race and navel of the world. And the Roman people did not declare war on them or make war on them for that. Yes, indeed, but I used to think that, with respect to your control and supervision of activities in those territories, there was a difference between that earlier period when Greece and Asia were as yet not under your jurisdiction and authority, and this one, when you have fixed the Taurus range as the boundary of Roman dominion, a time when you grant independence and tax exemption to excommunicate, when you have fixed the Taurus range as the boundary of Roman dominion, a time when you grant independence and tax exemption to communities, add territories to some, take land from others, impose taxes on yet others, a time when you augment, diminish, give, and remove kingdoms, and consider it your responsibility to ensure these peoples have peace on land and sea. If Antiochus had not withdrawn his garrisons, you would not now consider Asia liberated, even if those garrisons had remained at peace within their citadels. Would you? And if the armies of the Gauls were now wandering far and wide, would the gifts you made to Eumenes, or the independence you granted to the city-states, be secure? But why am I using this line of argument, as I made the Gauls my enemies and did not receive them as such? I appealed to you, Lucius Scipio. It was to have your courage and success alike that I prayed, and not in vain, to the immortal gods when I succeeded to your command, and to you, Publius Scipio, who had the legal position of legate, but the eminence of colleague, both in the eyes of your consul brother and those of the troops. I ask you to tell us if you know that there were legions of Gauls in Antiochus's army, if you saw them in the line of battle, located on both flanks, evidently representing his greatest strength, if you fought with them as with a regular enemy, killed them, and brought back spoils from them. And yet, it will be said, it was with Antiochus and not the Gauls that the Senate had decreed, and the people enjoined that there be war. But in my view, what they had decreed and enjoined was also directed against those in Antiochus's camp. Of these, all who bore arms against us on behalf of Antiochus were still our enemies, all apart from Antiochus, with whom Scipio had concluded a peace treaty, and with whom you had expressly directed that an accord be reached. More than anyone, the Gauls were in this category, along with a number of petty kings and tyrants. Even so, I took it upon myself to negotiate peace with the others, after forcing them to atone for their wrongdoings, as the dignity of your empire required, and to probe the feelings of the Gauls, in the hope that their native brutality could be modified. It was only after I saw that they were wild and unrelenting that I concluded that force of arms was required to bring them to heel. Since the charge of starting the war has been disposed of, I must now account for my conduct of it. Here I would feel confidence in my case, even if it were not before the Roman Senate, that I was appearing but the Senate of Carthage, where they say commanders are crucified. For poor strategy in a campaign, even if it is successful, now in fact I am appearing in the state which brings the gods into the commencement and conduct of all its enterprises, for the very reason that it subjects to no man's critical remarks actions which have received divine approval, in the state which, in its formulaic language, authorizing public thanksgiving or a triumph, includes the expression, inasmuch as he has well and successfully performed public business. Suppose I were reluctant to vaunt my military prowess, suppose I thought it overweening and presumptuous to do this, but that I still requested that due honor be paid to the immortal gods only for my own good fortune, and that of my army, in defeating such a great tribe with no casualties amongst our soldiers. And suppose I asked also that I myself should climb in triumph to the Capitol, the place from which I set off after the formal declaration of my vows. Would you, in this state, deny this to me, and to the immortal gods as well? 49. You would, you say. I fought an unfavorable ground. Tell me then, on what more favorable ground could I have fought? The enemy had seized a hill, and were it a fortified position. Obviously, if I wanted to defeat them, I had to go to the enemy. Well, just suppose they had a city in that spot, and were keeping to their walls. Obviously, they would need to be attacked. So, did Manius Acilius fight with Antiochus on favorable ground at Thermopylae? Why was resurrected the old ones relating to the extravagance of Scipio's? Again, backing up. Why was not Philip in a similar position occupying the heights overlooking the river Aos when he was dislodged by Titus Quinctius? In fact, I have been so far unable to work out what conception my opponents have of this enemy, or how they wish you to imagine him. If it is as one degenerate and corrupted by the delights of Asia, what danger was there in facing him even on the unfavorable ground? If it is as an enemy fearsome for his barbarous character and physical strength, do you then refuse a triumph for a victory of such magnitude? This is blind jealousy, members of the Senate, which knows only how to disparage acts of courage and sully the honors and rewards that accrue from them. So I ask for your indulgence, members of the Senate, if my address to you has been rather protracted, not through any desire on my part to sing my own praises, but from the need to defend myself against these charges. Another point. On the journey through Thrace, could I have broadened passes that were narrow, leveled high ground, made cultivated areas out of wild forest? Could I have ensured that Thracian bandits were nowhere skulking in lairs known only to them, that no piece of baggage be filched, and no pack animal taken from a column of each length? That no one be wounded, and that the valiant and stalwart Quintus Minucius not die of his wound? They focus on this unhappy accident, which made us lose a citizen of such qualities. The fact is that the enemy attacked us in a different pass, in unfamiliar territory, but two battle lines of ours, from the front and rear of the column, respectively, simultaneously encircled the barbarian force, which struck close to the baggage, and killed or captured many thousands that very day, and many more a few days later. Even if they say nothing about this, can they believe that you are not going to know about it when the whole army is witness to what I say? Had I not drawn my sword in Asia? Had I not set eyes on the enemy there, I should still have been entitled to a triumph for the two battles in Thrace. But I have said enough. In fact, members of the Senate, I should like to request and be granted your indulgence for tiring you with an address longer than I would have wished. 50. On that day, the accusations would have prevailed over the defense had not the Senate drawn out the debate into the evening. When the House broke up, the feeling was that the Senate was going to refuse the triumph. But the following day, the relatives and friends of Gnaeus Manlius exerted great pressure on his behalf, and the authority of the senior members also carried weight. The latter claimed that there was no known precedent for a commander entering the city without the triumphal carriage and laurel wreath, as a private citizen denied his meed of honor, when he had crushed an enemy, fulfilled his allotted assignment, and brought home his army. Embarrassment prevailed over spite, and a crowded Senate authorized the triumph. After this, all discussion and recollection of the debate were eclipsed by a more monumentous confrontation involving a man of greater stature and distinction. According to Valerius Antius Publius, Scipio Africanus was impeached by the 2 Quinti Petillae, an event to which people reacted according to their various inclinations. Some had harsh words, not for the plebeian tribunes, but for the entire community, for being able to tolerate such a thing. The 2 greatest cities in the world were found, virtually at the same time, guilty of ingratitude towards their most prominent citizens, they said, but Rome's ingratitude was the greater in that it was a defeated Carthage. That had driven a defeated Hannibal into exile, whereas a victorious Rome was in the process of driving out a victorious Africanus. Others opined that no one citizen should have such preeminence as to be above legal investigation. Nothing fostered the impartial application of justice as much as the requirement that all the most powerful people defend themselves in court. Without accountability, can anyone be entrusted with anything at all, much less the governance of the state? Force could be legitimately used on anyone unable to accept the impartiality of justice, they argued. Such were the arguments put forward in conversation until the day of the trial arrived. Nobody before that time, not even Scipio himself during his consulship or censorship, had been escorted to the forum by a greater crowd of people of all stations than was the defendant on that day. Instructed to plead his case, he made no reference to the charges, but launched into a discourse on his own career, so stirring that it was generally agreed that no one had ever received a more eloquent eulogy or one closer to the truth. For in the statement of his achievements he revealed the same spirit and character as when he accomplished them, and he did not offend the ears of his listeners, because these were brought up when he was at risk in court, not as self-advertisement. 51. To lend credibility to the present charges, the plebeian tribunes resurrected the old ones relating to the extravagance of Scipio's winter quarters in Syracuse, and the troubles caused by Flaminius at Locri. Then they accused Scipio of misappropriation of funds, using circumstantial rather than hard evidence. His son, who had been taken prisoner, was released without ransom, they noted, and in everything else Scipio had been cultivated by Antiochus in a way that suggested that in his hands alone rested the decision on peace or war with the Romans. In the province, he had behaved as a dictator rather than a legate towards the consul, they said. His sole reason for going there had been to make clear to Greece, Asia, and all the potentates and peoples lying to the east, something of which Spain, Gaul, Sicily, and Africa had long been persuaded, namely, that one man was the head and mainstay of the Roman Empire, and that the state that ruled over the entire world lay in the shadow of Scipio, whose nod had the force of senatorial decrees and directives from the people. A man untouched by scandal, they hounded with all the malice of which they were capable. The speeches dragged out till nightfall, and the session was adjourned to another day. When that day arrived, the tribunes took their seats on the rostra at dawn. The defendant was summoned, and he approached the rostra through the midst of the crowd, with a large column of friends and clients attending him. Silence fell, and Scipio declared, "Tribunes of the people and citizens of Rome, this was the day on which I fought a pitched battle with Hannibal and the Carthaginians in Africa, and did so meritoriously and successfully. It is therefore proper to avoid litigation and strife today. I shall go forthwith from this place to the Capitol to pay my respects to Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, to Juno, to Minerva, and to the other deities who protect our capital and citadel. I shall thank them for having granted me the will and the occasion to render outstanding service to my state both on this very day and on many other occasions. You, too, go along with me, citizens, those of you for whom it is convenient, and ask the gods in your prayers for men like me as your leaders, but do so only if, from the time I was 17 up to my old age, you have continually conferred your honors upon me before the due time. And if I, for my part, have shown myself by my record to be in advance of these honors of yours." From the rostra he climbed to the Capitol. At the same time the whole gathering turned and followed Scipio in such numbers that in the end even the clerks and messengers left the tribunes, with whom there now remained nobody apart from their retinue of slaves, and the herald, who from the rostra used the summon to defend it. Again. From the rostra he climbed to the Capitol. At the same time the whole gathering turned and followed Scipio in such numbers that in the end even the clerks and messengers left the tribunes, with whom there now remained nobody apart from their retinue of slaves, and the herald, who from the rostra used to summon the defendant. Scipio, attended by the people of Rome, did the rounds of all the temples of the gods throughout the city, and not just on the Capitol. The public acclamation he then received, and the genuine appreciation expressed for his greatness, almost made that day more famous than the one on which he rode into the city in triumph over Sphax and the Carthaginians. '52. This was the last brilliant day to shine on Publius Scipio. After it, he could see that what he had in prospect was malicious wrangling with the tribunes, and when the case was adjourned for a lengthy period, he retired to his estate at Liternum, determined not to make an appearance to defend himself. His spirit and personality were too great, and wedded to fortunes too great, for him to be able to stand trial and put himself in the demeaning position of pleading a case in court. When the trial date arrived and the summons went out for the absent defendant, Lucius Scipio adduced illness as the reason for his brother's non-appearance. The tribunes responsible for the indictment refused to accept this plea. Scipio's failure to appear in his defense, they said, was motivated by the same pride which had earlier made him quit his trial. The tribunes of the people and the assembly, the time when he had been attended by the people whom he had deprived of the right and freedom to judge him, and when, taking these along as his prisoners, he had celebrated a triumph over the Roman people and orchestrated on that day a session to the Capitol away from the tribunes of the people. So you have the reward for that. So you have the reward for that injudicious again. So you have the reward for that injudicious move, they said. You have yourselves been abandoned by the man who led and incited you when you abandoned us. And day by day our resolution has weakened to the point whereas 17 years ago, when Scipio commanded an army and a fleet, we had the nerve to send plebeian tribunes and an aedile to Sicily to arrest him and bring him back to Rome. Now, when he is a private citizen, we have not the nerve to send him to pull him from his country estate to defend himself in court. When an appeal was made to the tribunes of the plebs by Lucius Scipio, these made the following decree. If illness were adduced as the reason for the defendant's failure to appear, their wish was that this reason be accepted and the trial date be held over by their colleagues. One of the plebeian tribunes at this date was Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, who had a personal feud going on with Publius Scipio. Gracchus refused to have his name added to his colleague's decree, making everyone expect an even more severe judgment from him. Instead, he made the following pronouncement. Lucius Scipio's plea of sickness on his brother's behalf he found satisfactory, he said, and he would not permit any accusation of Publius Scipio to proceed before the latter returned to Rome. Even at that point, he continued, if Scipio appealed to him, he would help him avoid a court appearance. Through his achievements and the honors granted him by the Roman people, Publius Scipio had, by the agreement of gods and men, reached such a high standing that for him to stand as a defendant beneath the rostra and give ear to the abusive comments of the young was a greater disgrace for the people of Rome than for the man himself. Gracchus added angry words to his official pronouncement. Tribunes, is he going to stand at your feet? Scipio, the famed conqueror of Africa? Is this why he defeated and drove back 4 of the Carthaginians, most renowned commanders in Spain, and 4 armies? Why he captured Sfax and vanquished Hannibal? Why he made Carthage pay tribute to us, and pushed back Antiochus to the far side of the Taurus range? For Lucius Scipio recognized his brother as his partner in this glorious achievement. All this so that he should grovel before the 2 Patillae and see you seek the palm branch of victory over Publius Africanus? Will no services that they have performed, no honors that you have bestowed, citizens, ever allow men of distinction to reach a bastion secure and virtually sacrosanct that permits their advancing years finally to come to rest free from attack, if not with respect? Gracchus's formal pronouncement and the words appended to it had an effect not just on the others present, but even on Scipio's accusers. They stated that they would consider their legal rights and duties. After this, the assembly of the people was adjourned, and the Senate went into session. At the meeting, Tiberius Gracchus was profusely thanked by the entire senatorial order, but especially by the consular and senior members, for having set the interest of the state above private squabbles, and the Patillae were showered with abuse for having tried to gain a reputation by inciting hatred against another, and for looking for spoils from a triumph over Africanus. No more was heard of Africanus after that. He lived out his life at Liternum, and did not miss the city. They say that on his deathbed he gave instructions that he be buried in that same spot in the country, and his tomb be set up there so that his funeral not take place in his ungrateful native region. He was a remarkable man, but more remarkable for his military rather than his peacetime capabilities. The early part of his life was more distinguished than his final years, because in his youth there was incessant warfare, whereas with old age his career also lost its bloom and no scope was offered to his talents. His second consulship cannot stand comparison with his first, even if one adds the censorship. Then there was his position of the second in command in Asia, rendered inconsequential by ill health and sullied by his son's mishap, as well as by the need to face trial after his return, or else to quit both the trial and his native region at the same time, and the same time. Again, then there was his position of second in command in Asia, rendered inconsequential by ill health and sullied by his son's mishap, as well as by the need to face trial after his return, or else to quit both the trial and his native region at one and the same time. But no war fought by the Romans was greater and more fraught with danger than the Punic War, and he above all took the greatest share of the glory for bringing it to an end. 54. With the death of Africanus, the morale of his opponents improved. Chief amongst these was Marcus Porcius Cato, who, even during Scipio's lifetime, made a habit of carping at the man's eminence. It is thought that Cato was responsible for the Petilli commencing their suit against Africanus while he was alive, and introducing their bill after his death. The bill was worded much as follows: Citizens, with regard to the portion of the moneys captured, removed, and exacted from Antiochus and those under his command, and which was not delivered to the public purse, is it your wish and command that the urban praetor, Servius Sulpicius, put to the Senate the question of which of the current praetors it wishes to investigate the matter? At first, Quintus and Lucius Mummius tried to veto the bill, expressing the view that it was only fair that it be the Senate that investigate any case of moneys not paid into the public purse, as had invariably been done in the past, and Petilli proceeded with an attack on the prestige of the Scipios and their dominant position in the Senate. Lucius Furius Propurio, a consular, who had been one of the 10 commissioners in Asia, opined that the scope of the inquiry should be broadened to include moneys taken from other kings and peoples, not merely Antiochus. Targeting thereby his enemy, Gaius Manlius, Lucius Scipio came forward to oppose the bill, evidently more with a view to defend himself than to attack the proposal. Scipio protested that it was the death of his brother Publius Africanus, a man of superlative bravery and distinction, that had occasioned the proposal. It was not enough that there was no eulogy for Africanus at the rostra after his death. He had to be denounced as well. Even the Carthaginians had been content with Hannibal being sent into exile. He said, but the Roman people could not be satisfied even with the death of Publius Scipio. No, the man's reputation was to be torn to shreds while he lay in the grave, and his brother, too, was to be sacrificed, a further victim of envy. Marcus Cato spoke in favor of the bill. His speech on the money of King Antiochus still survives, and used his influence to deter the Mummi, the tribes, from opposing it. Accordingly, when these withdrew their veto, all the tribes voted in favor of the bill. Again, Marcus Cato spoke in favor of the bill. His speech on the money of King Antiochus still survives, and used his influence to deter the Mummi, the tribunes from opposing it. Accordingly, when these withdrew their veto, all the tribes voted in favor of the bill. 55. Servius Sulpicius then raised the question of whom the senators wished to conduct the inquiry specified by the Petilian law, and they designated Quintus Terentius Cullio. This praetor was so friendly with the Cornelian family, according to those people who claim that Publius Scipio's death and funeral took place in Rome, for there is also a report of this, that he preceded the bier in the funeral ceremony, wearing a freedman's cap, just as he had done at Scipio's triumph, and distributed mulled wine at the Porta Capena to those who attended the funeral. Cullio did this, they say, because he had been amongst the prisoners delivered from the enemy hands in Africa by Scipio. Alternatively, Cullio is said to have been on such bad terms with the family that he was the one particularly selected by the anti-Scipio faction to conduct the inquiry, because his animosity was well known. At all events, it was before this praetor, too favorably or too unfavorably disposed to him, that Lucius Scipio was immediately arraigned. At the same time, the names of Aulus and Lucius Hostilius, Scipio's officers, were brought forward and accepted for indictment, as was that of Scipio's quaestor, Gaius Furius Eculio, to make it look as if everything was tainted with corruption by association. Even 2 secretaries and an attendant were indicted. Lucius Hostilius, the secretaries, and the attendant were acquitted before Scipio's case came to court. But Scipio, his officer Aulus Hostilius, and Gaius Furius were found guilty. The verdict was that Scipio had received 6,000 pounds of gold and 480 pounds of silver, more than he deposited in the treasury for Antiochus to be granted a more favorable peace treaty, while Aulus Hostilius had taken 80 pounds of gold and 403 of silver, and Furius the quaestor 130 pounds of gold and 200 of silver. Such are the amounts of gold and silver which I found in the work of Antius. In Lucius Scipio's case, I should prefer to assume a scribal error rather than misrepresentation on the author's part with respect to the amounts of gold and silver. It is more plausible for there to have been a greater quantity of silver than gold, and for the fine to have been set at 4 million rather than 24 million sesterces. This is made all the more probable because there is a report that a justification of such a sum had been asked of Publius Scipio himself in the Senate. This account has it that Scipio told his brother Lucius to bring to him his ledger, and then tore it to bits with his own hands before the eyes of the Senate, furious that he was being asked to account for 4 million when he had brought 200 million to the treasury. He demonstrated the same self-confidence, they say, when the quaestors dared not break the law by drawing money from the treasury. He asked for the keys and said that he would open the treasury because it was he who had been responsible for its being closed.